It was still dark when the first unmarked SUV rolled to a stop at the corner of 31st and N Streets in Georgetown. The street was quiet, just the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant hum of a city not yet awake. A few porch lights glowed softly behind iron gates, and the old brick townhouses stood like silent sentinels, their windows shuttered against the chill of early autumn. Nothing about the morning suggested anything out of the ordinary. But inside one of those homes, a man who had spent decades shaping national policy was about to have his world collapse. He'd gone to bed the night before like any other evening, reviewing briefing notes, sipping a single glass of bourbon, checking his phone one last time before turning off the light. He was used to pressure, used to scrutiny. As one of the most powerful senators in Washington, he'd weathered ethics inquiries, media storms, even a messy divorce that played out in the tabloids years ago. But this was different. He didn't know it yet, but his name was already being typed into federal arrest warrants. His photo pulled up in secure Justice Department databases. His fate sealed by evidence gathered over months in secret. At exactly 6:03 a.m., 3 more vehicles arrived, parking with practiced silence. Men and women in dark jackets stepped out, not in uniforms, but with the unmistakable posture of federal agents. They moved quickly, efficiently, forming a perimeter around the house. One held a tablet showing the floor plan. Another checked a radio earpiece. No sirens, no shouting, just the quiet certainty of an operation long planned. Inside, the senator was already stirring. He liked to wake early, before the city stirred, to read the news and draft notes for the day's meetings. He padded into the kitchen in slippers and a faded robe, the kind he'd owned for years but kept because it was comfortable. He filled the kettle, clicked on the stove, and glanced out the window toward the street. That's when he saw them. At first he thought it might be a mistake. Maybe a neighbor had called the police over a noise complaint. But then he saw the way they stood, deliberate, focused, watching his windows. His stomach dropped. He knew that look. He'd seen it on Capitol Hill during security briefings, in photos from raids he'd authorized as part of oversight committees. Now it was pointed at him. Before he could react, a firm knock echoed through the house, not aggressive but authoritative. He didn't answer. He just stood there, kettle in hand, heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The knock came again, louder this time. Then a voice, calm but clear. "Senator, this is the Department of Justice. Please open the door." He set the kettle down. His hands trembled slightly, but he forced himself to walk to the front door. He didn't bother checking the peephole. He already knew who was there. He unlocked the deadbolt and chain, opened the door just enough to see a woman holding a badge and a folded piece of paper. "Good morning, sir," she said. "We have a federal arrest warrant for your arrest." He didn't argue, didn't shout, just nodded slowly as if he'd been expecting this for a long time without admitting it to himself. "May I get dressed?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "We'll wait right here." He stepped back inside, closed the door gently, and walked upstairs. In the bedroom, he stared at his reflection in the mirror. Graying hair, tired eyes, the lines on his face deeper than he remembered. He changed into slacks and a button-down shirt, no tie, slipped on his shoes, ran a hand over his face. Then he went back downstairs. The agents were still in the foyer, respectful but watchful. One of them handed him a coat. "It's chilly out," she said, almost kindly. He thanked her quietly. They didn't cuff him, not yet, but they stayed close as they walked him out the front door. That's when the world saw him. A news helicopter, drawn by a tip or maybe just routine surveillance of high-profile addresses, circled overhead. Its spotlight swept across the lawn. Neighbors peeked through curtains. A jogger stopped mid-stride, phone already raised. Within minutes, the images were flying across the internet. The senator, head slightly bowed, walking between 2 agents toward a waiting sedan. No dramatic struggle, no defiant speech. Just a man who had held immense power, now reduced to a suspect in a federal case. By 6:45 a.m., every major news outlet had broken into regular programming. Breaking: prominent U.S. senator arrested in federal corruption probe. Social media exploded. Political analysts scrambled to update their morning segments. Staffers on Capitol Hill arrived at work to a flood of texts and calls from reporters. Some were shocked. Others whispered, it was only a matter of time. Back at the townhouse, agents moved through the home with quiet precision. They bagged his phones, laptops, even his handwritten notes. In the study, they found a locked drawer. It took less than 2 minutes to open. Inside, stacks of unreported cash, a burner phone, and a ledger with coded entries next to names and dates. None of it was hidden well, just tucked away as if he believed his position would keep him safe from consequences. Meanwhile, downtown, the news spread like wildfire through congressional offices. In the Senate chamber, normally buzzing with pre-session chatter, an eerie hush fell over the room. Colleagues avoided eye contact. Some looked genuinely stunned. Others exchanged knowing glances. The senator had been a fixture in Washington for over 2 decades, chair of the Appropriations Committee, a key voice on defense spending, a mentor to dozens of younger lawmakers. Now his name was trending alongside words like bribery, foreign influence, and indictment. His staff, many of whom had worked for him for years, were left reeling. One aide sat at her desk, tears streaming down her face, clutching a coffee mug with his campaign logo. She'd believed in his mission, his speeches about public service, his promises to drain the swamp. Now she wondered how much of it had been real, and how much had been a performance. At the Justice Department, prosecutors held a closed briefing. They confirmed the charges: conspiracy to accept bribes, obstruction of justice, and violations of campaign finance laws tied to a foreign lobbying firm with documented ties to a nation considered adversarial to U.S. interests. The evidence, they said, was overwhelming: emails, financial records, and, most damning of all, audio recordings made by a trusted member of his own team. That detail sent another shockwave through the Capitol. Someone close to him had turned, someone who knew his routines, his secrets, his vulnerabilities. In Washington, betrayal cuts deeper than scandal. Loyalty is currency, and now everyone wondered who else might be talking. By mid-morning, the White House issued a terse statement: "We are aware of the situation and will let the justice system run its course." No condemnation, no defense, just distance. Political allies who had praised him just days earlier now issued carefully worded comments about due process and presumption of innocence, phrases that sounded more like distancing than support. Outside the federal courthouse where he was booked, a small crowd had gathered. Some held signs demanding accountability. Others stood in silence watching the building where decisions that shaped their lives were often made. And now, where one of its architects was being processed like any other defendant. A veteran who'd served under defense programs the senator had championed stood with his arms crossed, shaking his head. "If it's true," he said to a reporter, "then he didn't just break the law, he broke trust." Back in his holding cell, a small, windowless room with a metal bench and a stainless steel toilet, the senator sat alone. No phone calls, no visitors, just time to think. He thought about the first time he'd walked into the Capitol, full of hope and ambition. He thought about the bills he'd passed, the people he'd helped, the compromises he'd made for the greater good. And he thought about the moment he crossed the line, the first envelope of cash, the first off-the-books meeting, the first time he told himself it was just how things worked in this town. Now, the city he'd helped run was turning against him, not with riots or outrage, but with a cold, quiet reckoning. The kind that doesn't make headlines for long, but changes everything. As the sun rose higher over the Potomac, casting long shadows across the monuments and memorials, Washington, D.C. kept moving. Buses rolled. Tourists snapped photos. Lawmakers debated budgets and border policy. Life went on. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The arrest wasn't just about one man. It was a reminder that in a city built on power, even the most untouchable can fall, and when they do, the ground shakes for everyone. In the days after the arrest, Washington didn't just talk, it unraveled. What had begun as a single morning raid in Georgetown quickly spiraled into something far bigger, like pulling one loose thread and watching the whole suit come apart. At first, people whispered in hallways, exchanged nervous glances in cafeterias, or sent hushed texts under conference room tables. But soon the whispers turned into headlines, and the headlines turned into panic. The story wasn't just about a powerful senator anymore. It was about who else was involved, how deep it went, and whether anyone in the Capitol could truly be trusted. And at the heart of it all was someone no one had expected: his own chief of staff. She hadn't planned to become a whistleblower. For years, she'd been loyal, working late nights, canceling vacations, defending him in private meetings when others questioned his judgment. She believed in the mission, or at least she told herself she did. But over time, things started to feel off. Small things at first. A sudden consulting fee paid to a shell company with no real office. A foreign lobbyist showing up at a private dinner with no official reason to be there. Then came the encrypted messages, the cash deliveries disguised as gifts, and the way he'd shut down any questions with a sharp, "You don't need to know that." She tried to ignore it. Told herself it was just politics, messy, complicated, sometimes gray. But then she overheard a phone call. Just a few sentences, but enough to make her blood run cold. He was promising to fast-track a defense contract in exchange for a donation routed through an offshore account. And the recipient wasn't American. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table staring at her laptop, heart racing. She knew what she was considering could destroy her career, maybe even put her in danger. But she also knew that if she stayed silent, she'd be part of the problem. So she made a choice. She started recording. Not everything, just the moments that felt wrong. A conversation in his office about keeping certain donors happy. A late-night call where he gave instructions on how to hide a payment. She used a small digital recorder, the kind you could buy at any electronics store, and kept it hidden in her bag or tucked into a coat pocket. She didn't tell anyone. Not her family, not her closest friend, not even her lawyer, because she wasn't sure she'd go through with it until the very end. Then came the day the Justice Department reached out. They'd been investigating the foreign lobbying firm for months, following money trails that led back to multiple lawmakers. When they got a tip about unusual activity in the senator's office, they dug deeper, and that's when they found her. At first, she denied everything, said she was just doing her job, but after 2 quiet meetings in a secure room downtown, she handed over the recordings. Not out of revenge, she later told investigators, but because she couldn't look at herself in the mirror anymore. When the news broke that a key aide had cooperated with federal authorities, the reaction on Capitol Hill was instant and brutal. Doors that had once been open to her slammed shut. Former colleagues stopped returning her calls. One longtime friend sent a single text, "How could you?" She didn't reply. She'd expected it. In Washington, loyalty isn't just valued, it's demanded. And betrayal, even when it's for the right reasons, is never forgiven. But the recordings changed everything. They weren't just vague hints or circumstantial evidence. They were clear, chilling, and undeniable. In one, the senator said, "As long as the money flows, the votes will follow." In another, he laughed about how nobody checks the fine print anymore. Prosecutors played snippets during closed briefings, and even hardened officials winced as the details leaked, slowly, carefully, through anonymous sources. The scope of the scheme became clearer. It wasn't just one bribe or one shady deal, it was a system. Over 5 years, millions of dollars had moved through fake consulting contracts, luxury vacations paid for by foreign entities, and campaign contributions laundered through third parties. The money came from a firm called Viridian Global, which claimed to offer strategic advisory services, but had no real clients outside a handful of countries with tense relations with the U.S. Worse. Some of the bills the senator had pushed, especially those involving military spending and surveillance technology, seemed tailored to benefit companies tied to those same countries. One defense contract worth over $200 million had been rushed through committee with unusual speed. Now investigators were asking, was it national interest or personal profit? The fallout hit fast. 2 junior lawmakers who'd received campaign donations traced back to Viridian announced they were stepping down to focus on family. A third denied wrongdoing, but agreed to return the funds to avoid distraction. Lobbyists who'd once walked the halls of Congress with confidence suddenly found their security badges deactivated. Firms that had proudly listed the senator as a client scrubbed his name from their websites overnight. Even the media shifted. At first, coverage focused on the drama, the arrest, the fall from grace. But now, reporters started digging into the mechanics of the corruption. How did the money move? Who looked the other way? Why did ethics complaints filed years ago go nowhere? The story was no longer just about one man's greed. It was about a system that allowed it to happen and maybe even encouraged it. Inside the Justice Department, the mood was tense but focused. This wasn't just another white-collar case. It touched national security, Intelligence officials quietly confirmed that some of the technology funded by the tainted contracts had ended up in places it shouldn't have. Not enough to cause a crisis, but enough to raise alarms. That's when the White House finally broke its silence. Not with a statement, but with a closed-door meeting between the president's top advisors and congressional leaders from both parties. The message was clear: clean this up, fast. Back in the public eye, the senator's legal team fought back hard. They painted their client as a victim of overreach, claiming the recordings were taken out of context and that the aide had a personal grudge. They argued he never knowingly broke the law, that he trusted his staff to handle compliance, and if mistakes were made, they weren't criminal. But the public wasn't buying it. Polls showed trust in Congress dropping to a new low. Even his longtime supporters began to waver. One retired teacher in Ohio, who'd voted for him 3 times, told a local reporter, "I didn't send him to Washington to take money from people who don't have our country's best interests at heart. I sent him to protect us." Meanwhile, the chief of staff disappeared from public view. She moved out of her apartment, changed her phone number, and stayed with a relative out of state. She wasn't in hiding exactly, but she knew her life would never be the same. Still, in quiet moments, she said she felt a strange kind of peace. "I lost my job," she told a friend over a rare phone call, "but I got my conscience back." On Capitol Hill, the atmosphere grew heavier. Staffers walked faster, spoke softer. Lobbyists avoided eye contact. Even the usual banter in the Senate dining room dried up. Everyone wondered, who's next? Was this just the tip of the iceberg? Rumors swirled about other investigations, other names being quietly reviewed by prosecutors. No one wanted to be the next headline. The Ethics Committee, long criticized as toothless, suddenly found its voice. It announced an emergency session and subpoenaed dozens of documents from lobbying firms, campaign finance records, and internal Senate communications. For the first time in years, members from both parties seemed united, not by ideology, but by fear. Fear of exposure, fear of scandal, fear that the public might finally demand real change. And in the middle of it all, the senator sat in his cell, cut off from the world he once ruled. He couldn't call his lawyer without supervision, couldn't read the newspapers, couldn't explain, defend, or spin. All he could do was wait and remember. He remembered the first time he met the foreign lobbyist, the man who'd started it all. It was at a fundraiser, all smiles and handshakes. The man spoke perfect English, wore an expensive suit, and talked about shared interests. At the time, it felt like normal business. Now, it felt like the beginning of the end. What hurt most wasn't the loss of power or the headlines. It was the silence from people he'd considered friends. The ones who'd laughed with him at dinners, asked for his advice, leaned on him during tough votes. Now, not a single one had reached out, not even a note, just radio silence. In Washington, that silence speaks louder than any verdict. As the days turned into a week, the city began to adjust, but not heal. The tremors from that early morning arrest were still rippling outward, shaking loose secrets, alliances, and illusions. People started asking harder questions. Not just what did he do, but how did we let this happen? And who else is doing the same thing? The story was far from over. In fact, it felt like it was just beginning. Because once you start pulling threads in a place like Washington, you never know how much will come undone or what you'll find underneath. The arrest had been shocking, the revelations gut-wrenching, but what followed was something deeper, quieter, and far more dangerous: a crisis of trust. Washington didn't just lose a powerful senator. It lost its sense of certainty. And in a city that runs on appearances, alliances, and unspoken rules, that kind of doubt spreads faster than any scandal. Within a week, Capitol Hill felt like a different place. The usual buzz of deal-making and backslapping gave way to hushed conversations and sideways glances. Staffers double-checked every email before hitting send. Lawmakers avoided group photos with lobbyists. Even the coffee carts outside the Rayburn building seemed quieter, as if the baristas sensed the tension in the air. It wasn't just about fear of getting caught. It was about shame. For years, people had joked about how things work in D.C., the favors, the gray areas, the wink and nod arrangements. But now, with federal agents knocking on doors and secret recordings playing in courtrooms, those jokes didn't feel funny anymore. They felt like confessions. The Senate chamber, once a stage for grand speeches and historic votes, now felt like a room full of people waiting for the other shoe to drop. During routine debates, senators spoke carefully, avoiding anything that might sound like a defense of the old ways. One veteran lawmaker known for his folksy charm stood at his desk and said simply, "We owe the American people more than excuses. We owe them honesty." The room fell silent, not because it was a brilliant line, but because it was so rare to hear someone say it out loud. Behind closed doors, the real reckoning began. A bipartisan ethics task force, something that hadn't met in over a decade, was suddenly called into emergency session. At first, no one expected much. These groups were usually full of polite talk and empty promises. But this time was different. People were scared, not just of prison, but of being forgotten, mocked, or worse, ignored by voters who'd finally had enough. The task force started by demanding records from every office that had taken money from firms linked to the investigation. Dozens of aides spent nights copying files, printing emails, and combing through years of expense reports. One young staffer, barely out of college, found a receipt from a luxury resort in the Caribbean paid for by a policy research group that didn't even have a website. When she showed it to her boss, he turned pale and said, "Burn that." "No, wait, save it. We might need it." Meanwhile, intelligence officials held a series of classified briefings for top lawmakers. What they revealed chilled even the most seasoned veterans. Some of the defense contracts pushed by the arrested senator hadn't just benefited foreign companies. They'd allowed sensitive technology to slip into the hands of governments actively working against U.S. interests, not enough to cause a full-blown security breach, but enough to give enemies a clearer picture of American capabilities. One general, speaking off the record, put it bluntly, this wasn't just corruption. It was negligence with consequences. The White House, which had stayed quiet for days, finally acted, not with a press conference, but with a quiet executive order, tightening rules on foreign lobbying and requiring real-time disclosure of all meetings between lawmakers and foreign representatives. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. And for the first time in years, both parties nodded in agreement, even if they didn't say it out loud. But the real storm wasn't in the halls of power. It was on the streets. Outside the Capitol, small groups began gathering, not with anger, but with signs that read accountability, not excuses and we see you. They weren't protesters in the traditional sense. Many were teachers, nurses, veterans, small business owners, people who'd watched their representatives make promises they never kept. One woman held a photo of her son, a soldier deployed overseas. "He risks his life," she told a reporter, "so people like that can live in comfort." It's not right. Inside office buildings across the city, junior staffers, many of them idealistic and underpaid, watched the news with a mix of disgust and heartbreak. They'd come to Washington to make a difference, not to clean up messes made by people who'd long forgotten why they got into public service. One intern, sorting mail in a Senate office, quietly slipped a resignation letter into an envelope. "I didn't sign up for this," she wrote. "I signed up to help people." Back in the federal detention center, the arrested senator received his first visitor, his lawyer. They met in a small room with a table bolted to the floor and a guard standing just outside the door. The senator looked thinner, his eyes tired. He asked about the news, about his staff, about whether anyone had spoken up for him. His lawyer hesitated, then said gently, "People are focused on protecting themselves right now." The senator nodded. He didn't argue. He just stared at his hands. "I thought I was playing the game," he said quietly. But the game was playing me. That same day, 2 more lawmakers announced they were stepping down, not because they'd been charged, but because donations they'd accepted years ago were now under scrutiny. They claimed they had no idea the money came from questionable sources. Maybe that was true, but in the new Washington, ignorance wasn't an excuse anymore. It was a liability. Lobbying firms scrambled to reinvent themselves overnight. Websites were updated with new ethics pledges. Old clients were dropped without explanation. One firm even held a press event where its CEO pledged to donate all future profits to charity, a move most saw as desperate, not noble. But not everyone ran for cover. In a small office near Union Station, a group of former congressional aides, some fired, some disillusioned, started meeting in secret. They weren't plotting revenge. They were building something new. A non-profit watchdog group designed to track lobbying activity in real time and alert the public when something looked off. They called it Clear Ledger, no fancy name, just a promise of transparency. Their first tip came from an unexpected source, a retired Capitol police officer who'd noticed unusual late-night meetings in certain offices over the past year. He didn't have proof, just a gut feeling. But in the current climate, gut feelings were starting to matter. As the days passed, the mood in the city shifted from shock to something harder: resolve. People were tired of being lied to, tired of watching the same cycle repeat: scandal, denial, forgetfulness, repeat. This time they wanted change. Real change. Not just new faces, but new rules. And slowly, quietly, those rules began to appear. A bill that had been stuck in committee for 3 years, requiring public disclosure of all lobbying contacts, suddenly gained dozens of co-sponsors. Another proposal to ban lawmakers from owning individual stocks while in office went from fringe idea to mainstream demand. Even talk of term limits, long dismissed as unrealistic, was being discussed in serious tones. None of it would happen overnight. Washington doesn't move fast, but for the first time in a long time it was moving in the right direction. Yet beneath the surface, tension remained. Because while most people welcomed accountability, others saw it as a threat. In private clubs and donor dinners, whispers grew louder. This is a witch hunt. They're making an example out of him. Next, they'll come for anyone who disagrees with the current administration. But those voices were getting quieter, because the public wasn't buying it anymore. Polls showed that over 70% of Americans, across party lines, believed stronger ethics laws were needed. Even in deeply red and deeply blue districts, voters were telling their representatives the same thing: clean up your act, or we'll clean house. One town hall meeting in a Midwestern state turned emotional when a farmer stood up and said, "I don't care if you're Democrat or Republican. If you're taking money from people who don't care about my family, you don't deserve my vote." The room erupted in applause. The senator on stage looked down at his notes, unable to meet the man's eyes. Back in D.C., the arrested senator's trial date was set. But by now, the story wasn't really about him anymore. It was about what came next. Would this be a moment that changed Washington, or just another scandal that faded with time? The answer, people sensed, depended on them. Not the politicians, not the pundits, but ordinary citizens who refused to look away. And in that quiet shift from outrage to action, from cynicism to demand, lay the real tremor. Not the kind that shakes buildings, but the kind that reshapes them, brick by brick. Law by law, choice by choice, Washington would never be the same. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what it needed. The courtroom was smaller than most people expected. No grand columns or dramatic lighting, just pale walls, uncomfortable wooden benches, and a hush so thick you could hear a pen drop. Outside, the city buzzed as usual. Tourists snapped photos of the Capitol, delivery trucks rumbled down Constitution Avenue, and interns hurried to meetings with coffee in hand. But inside room 312 of the federal courthouse, time seemed to slow. He walked in without fanfare. Dressed in a dark suit that looked slightly too big now, his hair neatly combed but his face drawn, he kept his eyes on the floor. No smirk, no defiant glare, just the quiet shuffle of a man who knew the weight of what was coming. Reporters packed the back rows, pencils ready, phones silenced. Cameras weren't allowed, but everyone knew the sketches would be on the evening news. The trial wasn't flashy. There were no surprise witnesses leaping from the gallery or last-minute confessions. Instead, it unfolded like a slow, methodical unraveling, thread by thread, email by email, recording by recording. The prosecution didn't need theatrics. The evidence spoke for itself. It started with bank records. Millions of dollars flowing through shell companies with names like Horizon Strategic Advisors and Patriot Policy Group, firms that existed only on paper, with no offices, no employees, no real work. Then came the emails, polite, professional on the surface but laced with coded language. "Appreciate your support on the infrastructure package," one read. "Looking forward to our discussion on maritime security." Beneath the formal tone, investigators saw a pattern: favors exchanged, votes promised, silence bought. But the real turning point came when the chief of staff took the stand. She walked in calmly, dressed in a simple navy blazer and black slacks. Her hands were steady, her voice clear. She didn't look at him. She looked at the jury, 12 ordinary people from different parts of the city, None of them politicians, none of them insiders. Just neighbors, teachers, mechanics, nurses, people who believed in fairness. She told her story plainly. How she'd started to notice things that didn't add up. How she'd tried to rationalize them at first. It's just how things get done. How she'd stayed quiet out of loyalty, out of fear, out of hope that it would stop on its own. And how finally she realized it wouldn't. I kept thinking, if not me, who? She said, her voice soft but firm. I worked for him for 8 years. I believed in the work we were doing, but somewhere along the way the mission got lost, and I didn't want to be part of that anymore. Then came the recordings. The prosecutor played 3 clips. In the first, the senator discussed a donation from a foreign-linked group in exchange for pushing a specific defense amendment. In the second, he instructed her to route a payment through a third party so it wouldn't raise flags. In the third, perhaps the most damning, he laughed and said, "As long as they keep writing checks, we'll keep writing laws." The courtroom didn't gasp. It didn't erupt. It just went still. Even the judge seemed to lean forward slightly. The senator, for the first time, looked up. His face tightened. Not with anger, but with something deeper. Recognition. He knew those words. He'd said them, and now they were hanging in the air like smoke after a gunshot. His defense team tried to fight back. They argued the recordings were taken out of context, that he was speaking loosely, joking, or referring to legal campaign contributions. They called a former aide who testified that the senator always stressed following the rules. But under cross-examination, that same aide admitted he'd never seen the financial side of things. I handled speeches and schedules, he said, not the money. Then came the surprise witness no one saw coming. A man in his late 40s, clean-shaven, wearing a crisp white shirt and no tie, stepped into the box. He introduced himself as a former executive at Viridian Global, the lobbying firm at the center of the scandal. He'd been granted immunity in exchange for full cooperation. Pale and nervous at first, he grew steadier as he spoke. He described how the firm didn't just lobby. It operated like a shadow arm of foreign interests. Clients paid not for advice, but for access. And the senator wasn't just a contact. He was a partner. He knew exactly who was behind the money, the man said. We met in private rooms off the books. He'd tell us which bills were coming up, which votes mattered, and what it would take to get them passed. In return, we made sure his campaign never ran short on funds, and that his personal expenses were covered. He described luxury trips to private islands, stock tips that turned into 6-figure gains, even a down payment on a vacation home wired through a dummy corporation. None of it was in his official disclosures. None of it was reported. When the prosecutor asked why he was testifying now, the man paused. Because I have kids, he said simply, and I don't want them growing up in a country where the rules only apply to some people. That line echoed through the room long after he stepped down. The defense's final argument was short. They didn't deny the payments happened. They argued he didn't know they were illegal, that he trusted his staff and advisors to handle compliance. He's not a lawyer, his attorney said. He's a public servant who made mistakes in judgment, not crimes. But the jury had heard too much. They'd seen the paper trail. They'd heard his own voice. And they'd watched the way he avoided looking at his former aide when she spoke. Deliberations began on a rainy Thursday. The jury was sequestered, cut off from news and phones. For 10 days they reviewed every document, replayed every recording, debated every word. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Pundits filled airtime with speculation. But inside that room there was no drama. Just 12 people trying to do what they believed was right. On the 11th morning, the foreperson sent a note to the judge. The courtroom filled within minutes. The senator walked in slowly, flanked by guards. His lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, but he didn't react. The verdict was read aloud. Guilty on all counts. Conspiracy to commit bribery, obstruction of justice, illegal campaign finance coordination. Each word landed like a stone in still water. He didn't collapse, didn't cry out, just closed his eyes for a long moment, then nodded slightly as if he'd known this was coming all along. His lawyer whispered something, but he didn't respond. He just stood, turned, and walked out, back to the holding cell, back to the reality he'd created. Outside, the crowd was quiet. No cheers, no boos, just a few sighs, a few nods. A veteran in a worn jacket stood near the steps watching the news vans pack up. Justice isn't loud, he said to no one in particular. It's just done. Later that evening, in a small apartment across the river, the chief of staff sat alone at her kitchen table. She hadn't watched the verdict live. She couldn't. But her phone buzzed with messages from old colleagues, distant relatives, even strangers thanking her. She read a few, then set the phone down. She poured a cup of tea, the same kind she used to make during late nights in the Senate office. Back then, she'd believed she was part of something important. Now she knew she still was, just in a different way. She thought about the recordings, about the fear she'd felt hitting record for the first time, about the nights she'd lain awake wondering if she'd ruined her life. And she realized she hadn't. She'd reclaimed it. Across town, in a federal holding unit, the senator sat on a narrow bed, staring at the cinder block wall. The noise of the city was gone. No phones, no aides, no applause, just silence. And in that silence, for the first time in years, he had to face himself. Not the title, not the power, but the choices. The trial was over. But the reckoning wasn't. Because in Washington, a verdict doesn't end a story. It starts a new one. One about what comes after the fall. Who learns? Who changes? And who finally decides that some lines shouldn't be crossed, no matter how high you climb. The sentencing hearing was held on a gray November morning. The kind where the sky hangs low and the air smells like rain that never comes. He stood quietly in the courtroom as the judge read the sentence. 12 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. No fine could undo what he'd done, the judge said, but time, real, measured time, might remind others that no office, no matter how powerful, places a person above the law. He didn't speak. Just nodded once, turned, and walked out between two guards, his hands now cuffed in front of him. The image, once a man who commanded rooms, now reduced to a number in a system, circulated online within minutes. But this time there was no outrage, no flood of hot takes. Just a quiet sense of finality, like the last page of a long, troubling chapter finally turning. Yet the story didn't end with him. In fact, it was just beginning for everyone else. Within weeks, Congress passed the Transparency in Foreign Lobbying Act, a law that would have seemed impossible just a year before. It required real-time public disclosure of all meetings between lawmakers and foreign representatives, banned the use of shell companies to hide political donations, and created an independent ethics watchdog with real enforcement power. Even more surprising? It passed with overwhelming support from both parties. Not because everyone suddenly agreed on everything, but because no one wanted to be the next headline. Campaign finance rules tightened too. Lawmakers could no longer accept consulting fees from vague organizations. Gifts over $50 had to be reported. And for the first time, every member of Congress had to undergo annual ethics training. Not a formality, but a session led by former prosecutors and whistleblowers who spoke plainly about consequences. Some grumbled it was overreach. Others called it theater. But most staff on the Hill quietly welcomed it. They'd been tired of the gray zones, the unspoken pressure to look the other way. Now they had cover to say no. Meanwhile, the chief of staff, the one who'd recorded the conversations and walked away from everything, started something new. She didn't seek the spotlight, didn't write a book or go on talk shows. Instead, she rented a small office near DuPont Circle and launched a nonprofit called Clear Ledger. Its mission was simple: track money and politics in real time and make it easy for anyone. Teachers, truck drivers, teenagers, to see who was funding what and why. At first, people thought it was just another DC project that would fade in a year. But then local news outlets started using their data. High school civics teachers built lesson plans around it. Voters in swing districts used it to question candidates at town halls. Within 6 months, Clear Ledger had tens of thousands of regular users. Not because it was flashy, but because it was honest. She hired a small team, mostly young people who'd left government jobs disillusioned, but still believed in public service. They worked long hours for modest pay, fueled by coffee and the quiet belief that transparency could actually change things. One intern, fresh out of college, said, "I used to think Washington was broken beyond repair. Now I think it's just fixable, one receipt at a time." Back in the prison where the former senator now lived, life moved at a different pace. He worked in the library, shelving books and helping other inmates fill out legal forms. He didn't talk about his past. didn't wear his old title like a badge, but sometimes when he thought no one was looking, he'd read the newspaper clippings his lawyer sent, articles about the new laws, the ethics reforms, the public's renewed demand for honesty. He never said it out loud, but those pages weighed heavier than any sentence. The Capitol itself began to change in subtle ways. Lobbyists still walked the halls, but they carried less swagger. Staffers asked harder questions before accepting dinner invitations. Even the tone of speeches on the Senate floor shifted. Less grandstanding, more substance. It wasn't perfect. Corruption doesn't vanish overnight. But the culture, the unspoken understanding that everyone does it, had cracked. And the public noticed. In the next election cycle, candidates who ran on clean government platforms won in districts that had been solidly red or blue for decades. Voters didn't care about party as much as they cared about integrity. One mayor in a mid-sized city summed it up. People aren't asking if you're left or right anymore. They're asking if you're straight with them. Schools started teaching media literacy and civic accountability earlier. Kids learned how to trace a campaign donation, how to spot lobbying influence, how to write to their representatives, not as a formality, but as a right. Teachers said students were more engaged than they'd been in years. They feel like their voice matters, one explained, because now they've seen it actually change things. Even the media evolved. Newsrooms created dedicated ethics desks. Investigative teams grew. And while sensationalism still sold clicks, there was a new respect for slow, careful reporting, the kind that follows the money, checks the records, and gives whistleblowers a fair chance to speak. Of course, not everything changed. Washington is still Washington. Deals are still made in quiet rooms. Ambition still drives people. But the rules of the game had shifted. Now there were guardrails, watchdogs, consequences that couldn't be brushed aside with a press release or a well-placed donation, and perhaps the most lasting change was in the people who worked behind the scenes, the aides, the clerks, the junior analysts. They'd watch someone they admired fall not because of one big mistake, but because of 1,000 small compromises. And they made a silent promise to themselves, not on my watch. One young staffer, sorting mail in a Senate office months after the trial, found an envelope addressed to a senior lawmaker from a foreign-linked group. Instead of passing it along, she flagged it to the new ethics compliance officer. It turned out to be harmless, a conference invitation, but the fact that she questioned it mattered, because now questioning was part of the job. Years later, when new interns arrived in D.C., wide-eyed and eager, they'd hear the story. Not as gossip, but as a lesson. Remember what happened, their supervisors would say. Power isn't the problem. It's what you do with it when no one's watching. The former senator's name faded from daily headlines. New scandals emerged, as they always do. But his case remained a reference point, a before and after moment. In law schools, it was studied as a turning point in political accountability. In ethics trainings, his recordings were played not to shame, but to warn, and in quiet corners of the Capitol, people still whispered it like a mantra. Remember Langston. Not to dwell in the past, but to protect the future. Because the real legacy of that shocking arrest wasn't the fall of one man. It was the rise of something else, something fragile but real, a renewed belief that public service should mean exactly that. Service, not privilege, not profit, not power for its own sake. The tremors that shook the nation's capital that October morning didn't destroy the system. They shook loose the rot, and in the space that opened up, something cleaner, clearer and more honest began to grow. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was a start. And sometimes in a city built on compromise, a start is enough.